Shabbat Shalom, family and friends. We are on the 30th Torah portion named Kedoshim, which translates to holy ones. It takes place in Leviticus chapter 19, and it includes also Leviticus chapter 20. For the prophets, it includes Amos chapter 9, verses 7 through 15, the book of Ezekiel chapter 20, verses 2 through 20. It also includes Psalms 85 and 86. And the renewed covenant reading is Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 48, chapter 15, the first 11 verses, and 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 21. This week's Torah portion covers various laws that we should follow. Some make a lot of sense, like not making your daughter a prostitute or committing adultery with another man's wife. I would say that even people in the world know these things are wrong. Then there are things that many people in the world don't have a problem with, but most Christians, or a lot of Christians, would recognize as wrong, like turning to mediums or spiritists, such as fortune tellers or psychics. Then there are laws in this Torah portion that many Christians dismiss as being done away with. In fact, there are laws in this Torah portion that others have tried to use to show me that we can't keep the whole law. And today, I would like to address some of these items. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse 27, it notes that you should not round the corners of your heads, neither shall you mar the corners of your beard. People can see this and think, how can we keep Torah but still shave or trim our heads and or beards? The word round in this verse is coming from the Hebrew word nakap, which means to strike off. Remember when Job was stricken with severe boils from the sole of his feet to the top of his head? Job would take a piece of pottery to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Now, Job uses this word nakap in Job chapter 19, verse 26, where it states, even after my skin is destroyed, that's the word nakap, yet from my flesh I will see God. This word is also found, nakap, in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 34, where it states, he would cut down, nakap, the thickets of the forest with an iron axe. So the word here means that we shouldn't destroy the hair on our heads or beards. So with that in mind, let's read the verse after this verse, which is verse 28. It states, you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am Yahweh. Now, if you take these items together, we could see where these items are listed together as it relates to mourning for the dead, or just mourning in general. The destroying the hair on your head, the destroying of the beard, as well as the cuttings of the flesh. So let's see where else we would find that in Scripture. So in Isaiah chapter 15, verse 2, it notes what happened upon the judgment of Moab. Okay, this is referring to Moab's devastation. And this is what's written in Isaiah. The people have gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep. Moab wails over Nebo and Medeba. Everyone's head is bald, and every beard is cut off. So we see here the mention of the head being shaved as well as the beard being cut off as it relates to mourning. Okay, we don't see here though mention of cutting of the flesh. So let's maybe check another passage. Jeremiah chapter 48 verse 37 notes the following on the prophecy against Moab, the same people. And it notes, for every head is shaved bald, and every beard cut short. There are gashes on all the hands, and sackcloth around the waist. So notice those gashes on the hands. What is that? That's pretty much the cutting of the flesh. So in this verse, we see all of these items listed together. The fact that the heads are shaved bald, the beard being cut, as well as cutting of the flesh. In this case, cutting of their hands. In Jeremiah, in the chapter before this, in verse 4, it's discussing the prophecy against Philistia, and it notes that because of the day that is coming to destroy all of the Philistines, to eliminate from Tyre and Sidon every surviving ally, for the Lord is going to destroy the Philistines, the remnant of the coastland of Caphtor. Baldness has come upon Gaza. Ashkelon has been destroyed. Remnant of their valley, how long will you gash yourself? So in this passage, we see mention of them shaving their heads as well as cutting themselves, gashing themselves. And we see this not only in Isaiah and Jeremiah, even in Ezekiel, chapter 27, verses 30 and 31, we see reference of these type of actions occurring as a sign of mourning. Okay? These practices were used by pagan nations to mourn and to weep. And what they're doing is that I believe that these were pretty dramatic practices where people are really tearing off their hair or beards. I mean, they're cutting themselves. That's pretty dramatic to me. And we see various places in Scripture that they're mentioned together, which gives us insight that these forbidden practices go together. And according to verse 28 of chapter 19 of Leviticus, we shouldn't be doing these things for the dead. And so that's what I believe it's in reference to, not the fact that just by someone shaving their head or not having a beard that they violated that commandment. And just as a side note, I mean, when we look at the Nazirite vow, which is in Numbers chapter 6, verse 5 notes that all the days of his vow of consecration, this is is in reference to a Nazirite, no razor shall pass over his head. He shall be holy until the days are fulfilled, which he lives as a Nazirite for the Lord. He shall let the locks of hair on his head grow long. The Nazirite vow was unique in that no razor shall pass over, which means to me that others apparently were cutting their hair on top of their head. And that was a way that a Nazirite had set themselves apart. So that's one of the items. Now, if we move up in that chapter, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, it states that we should not wear a garment of linen and wool. Now, some versions of the Bible, like the NASB, and I believe even the NIV, state not to wear a garment of two kinds of material mixed together. Now, if that was the case, if it was just two kinds of material mixed together, this will be incredibly hard to follow, since most clothes that are sold in the store are made up of more than one kind of material. So for this, we can use scripture to kind of help clarify what is being said. If you read in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 11, in other versions like the NASB and any other version, it clarifies stating that you should not wear a material, wear clothing that has wool and linen combined together. Now, if we isolate, if this commandment is isolated to not wearing material of wool and linen, it's much easier to keep than many people would think at first glance. First of all, that mixture of cloth for clothing is not very popular. And one of the reasons why it's not popular is because it actually could cause problems. As you know, there are scientific studies that show that the energy of these two fabrics put together collapse the electrical field. The frequencies from these materials, they cancel each other out, and they bring measurable weakness to the human body. And then I even read that in some tests it could even cause pain for certain individuals. So that particular one I think is easier, much easier to follow than what people think at first glance. Another command mentioned right before this command with cotton and linen is sowing your field with mingled seed. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that believers shouldn't have gardens? In Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 9, there's a similar verse that you should not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed. Now, it's important to note, and it may be obvious to some people, that these are two separate things. Vineyards are for growing grapes. Fields are for growing wheat and barley. And by the way, all of these items, the barley, the wheat, the grapes, they're all items associated with the three pilgrimage feasts. In Exodus chapter 22, verse 5, there's a command related to someone who has a vineyard or field, just, further proving that they're two separate things. Now, there's also a garden. A garden is a separate thing, is a separate word in Scripture. Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, we read that the Lord planted a garden in Eden that we know had all types of trees. In Isaiah and Jeremiah, like Isaiah chapter 58, verse 11, there are prophecies how Israel will be like a watered garden. And isn't it interesting that, the Garden of Eden was full of trees and there's an association of men being as trees? Well, gardens are meant to have different types of items. But they're also meant to be orderly. I mean, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it was strategically placed in the middle of the garden. It wasn't in a random place in the garden. So we established that gardens are different things. So what's the deal about fields and or vineyards having mixed seed? One is that there's no indication that one person couldn't have more than one field or vineyard. Depending on your wealth, you can have more than one field or vineyard. However, if you don't have much land, it's probably best to focus on one thing, because what you grow in your field or vineyard is going to be your main sustenance. It's going to be how you primarily make money. Remember that this is an agricultural society. Your garden may be for smaller things you may need or from which you supplement your food with. So rather than each person being self-sufficient, I believe God's plan for Israel was for them to work together, to rely on God and each other. Deuteronomy 22:9 notes that if this command is broken regarding mixed seed, your produce is defiled. How that word defiled is kadash, which is used for consecration or sanctification, which is why other translations of the Bible note that produce is going to be forfeited to the sanctuary. And I believe that's to remind that person that they are part of a larger community. They are part of a kingdom. Now, this was going to separate them from the nations around them. I mean, much of the commands in this Torah portion was to separate them from the other nations. At the end of our Torah portion in Leviticus 20, verse 23, it notes, "You shall not walk in the manners of the nations, which I cast out before you. For they committed all these things, and therefore I abhorred them." And so that concludes our Torah portion for this week. Shabbat Shalom.